Welcome to today's HTAi PCIG Patient Preferences Working Group webinar entitled, Do Patient Preferences Influence HTA Decisions? My name is Barry Stein and I'll be your moderator of today's session. And I'm also the patient representative on the Patient Preferences Working Group and also President and CEO of Colorectal Cancer Canada. Today's webinar is a follow-up to our four-part series that we did in 2020, where we covered an introduction to patient preferences in HTA decision-making, designing patient preferences studies for HTA, moving from aspiration to application engagement, patient preferences in HTA decision-making, where we looked at case studies moving from theory to implementation, and finally, we did patient preferences and value studies in oncology and rare diseases, and we entitled that Redefining Patient Advocacy in Health Technology Assessment. By way of background, the Health Technology Assessment International Patient and Citizens Involvement Group, Patient Preferences Working Group, initiated a project designed to improve the likelihood that patient preferences would be used more frequently in health technology assessment decision-making. The initial step of the project was to conduct an assessment of the current landscape of health technology assessment use in patient preferences and HTA decision-making, and interest in doing so, if not currently already done. The Patient Preference Working Group intends to facilitate a co-created patient preference case study between multiple HTAs where observations about best practices and considerations for adoption will be made. The purpose of today's webinar is to serve as a platform to kick off that project, to share our results of the landscape analysis and reactions from health technology assessment representatives from around the world on the validity, strengths, and weaknesses of the findings, and to engage our panel of expert thought leaders to discuss their reactions to the landscape assessment to help inform the project. And finally, we'll outline proposed next steps in the project. To present the landscape assessment, the HTAi PCIG Patient Preferences Working Group co-chair, Barry Lydon, who is also the Vice President of Patient Engagement at Edwards Lifesciences, will present the survey findings and qualitative research. Following Barry's presentation, I will introduce our distinguished panel members to react to the findings and share thoughts and responses to our questions. So Barry Lydon, take it away.
Thanks, Barry. Appreciate the opportunity here. Again, I'm Barry Lydon with Edwards Lifesciences, and I co-chair our Patient Preference Working Group at HTAi, along with my colleague Simon Pfeiffer, who works at Capri out of Sydney. So we went ahead and did a quantitative survey that was conducted in November that had 31 responses. You can see the breakdown of responses. We have a pretty good representation of the different regions. We did not have any responses from South America, but probably a pretty good balance in terms of responses globally. The first question was really around that we were somewhat surprised by was the percentage of number of respondents that actually are or believe they are using patient preference information in their decision making, and responded that in the last year, most or some of the drug or technology appraisals that have been submitted had included PPI in their appraisal. They identified the main barriers as really being time constraints and resources and ability for the HTAs themselves to really understand and process that information. So definitely an indication that there's some education and training and capabilities development that is an opportunity for us. When asked what the role of PPI is in the decision, the majority of respondents indicated that the information was supplementary or complementary to the main decision, that it was not really necessarily a deciding factor, but did help in the decision-making process. When asked whether or not the influence of PPI on the process or the quality or the outcome of the decision, we were actually very intrigued to find that the quality of the decision was really the highest scoring in terms of how much influence these respondents felt PPI could have or has had in their decision-making process. But we're also interested that there was a pretty good chunk of respondents that indicated that the outcome of the decision was influenced in some way as a result of PPI. So when asked why it was that there were some negative responses in that it was hard to quantify or it was maybe secondary to other evidence, you see some of the responses here, the qualitative responses, is that the actual impact of PPI in the decision itself is unclear, or it's rarely used in the actual weight of the decision. And some of that may be a perception that the quality of the data could appear to be poor or biased in some way. In terms of neutral responses, the main feedback was pretty consistent with some of the quantitative data, was that it's not really by itself something that could influence a decision. It has to be a piece of the evidence. And on the positive end of the spectrum, I think we had some not surprising feedback from a lot of HTAs who are obviously very interested in ensuring that the therapies that they review are of maximum benefit to the citizens that they're kind of representing in some respects. And so that there was there's one anecdote that they had actually used patient preference data to favorably approve or recommend a technology because the academic evidence was actually really quite poor, but the stories or the impact of PPI really helped in overturning the decision. And then as that last statement, I think many of us believe all healthcare should be patient-centered, and that the more that we do this, the better in terms of ensuring that we have more relevant health technology decisions. So a quick summary of that is that many HTAs are using PPI. They are interested in increasing the use of PPI. PPI impact varies on the final decision. There's a spectrum, heterogeneity, if you will. Some decisions, it looks like PPI actually overturned the decision or had a heavy influence. And in some cases, it was merely supplementary. And then there remains some skepticism or uncertainty of PPI, and that there are some resources or tools needed to help in that adoption. In addition to the work that we did here at HTAi, another organization, the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, of which I co-chair their Science of Patient Input Working Group and their Patient Preference Working Group, we conducted a series of one-on-one interviews and workshops with payers in the United States to assess if there are concerns about patient preferences. What are those concerns? We had 12 one-on-one interviews, 3 payer and HTA workshops that were facilitated by the Lewin Group, and it was a fairly good distribution of representatives of payers and HTAs. The key findings there was a lot of data that we got out of that. Don't want to spend a lot of time in the details of that at this point, but really we summarize it into 4 basic findings on the barriers to adoption of PPI. One is that payers don't really understand what PPI, very basic definitions of what it is and what it is not. Payers haven't seen many PPI submissions, but all of them indicated they would be very interested in seeing it more. Payers don't know how much to trust PPI, but we're going back to some of that quantitative data that there's some question as to the validity of it or the representation of it, and that payers don't know how to use PPI in their decisions. So I will turn it back to you, Barry, and the panelists to react to some of these findings. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Barry. So to react to the findings of the survey, and I found them extremely interesting, both pre this session and once again to have the opportunity to review them and to hear you present them, and to react to those survey findings and share their thoughts, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel. First, Dr. Jacqueline Bouvet. Jacqueline is the Technical Director at the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, in the UK, and she chairs national and parallel scientific advice meetings with medical device and pharmaceutical companies. She also works on the joint NICE, NHS England, and Department of Health and Social Care, DHSC, project that's developing new payment models for antimicrobials. And she is the Chief Analyst for NICE and DHSC's Health and Care Appraisal Working Group. Previously, Jacqueline worked in NICE's Science Policy and Research team. She led their work on a number of pan-European research projects, including the European Health Data and Evidence Network, health technology assessment of histology-independent cancer drugs, and the use of patient preference studies in health technology assessment. Before joining NICE, Jacqueline worked at the European Medicines Agency, and she held postdoctoral positions in the Netherlands at Erasmus University, Rotterdam, at Utrecht University. She has a PhD from Utrecht University and a Master's of Science in Health Economics from Erasmus University. Second, Dr. Nicole Mittman is the Chief Scientist and Vice President of Evidence Standards at the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. That's CADTH, more commonly known. Dr. Mittman leads CADTH's health science group, including the Health Economics Research Information Services and Scientific Affairs team. She joined CADTH from Cancer Care Ontario, where she held the position of Chief Research Officer. She holds a faculty position as an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology, and is an associate scientist at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre. Dr. Mittman is also the co-chair of the Committee of Economic Analysis at the Canadian Cancer Trials Group. Responsibilities include embedding economic parameters into clinical trials, economic evaluations, and guideline development. In her academic capacity, Dr. Mittman has conducted and collaborated on notable research in areas of economic evaluations, outcome research, and drug and patient safety. Her research methodologies include the examination of large databases, economic methodologies, and decision analysis. She holds a Master's of Science and PhD in Pharmacology from the University of Toronto. Dr. Lori Lambert has completed her Master's of Public Health and in the Epidemiology and Biostatistics stream at the University of Western Australia. She then received a 4-year Australian National Health and Medical Research Training Scholarship to pursue her PhD. From 2004 to 2020, Lori was a scientific coordinator of the Cardiovascular Evaluation Unit at Quebec's Institut National d'Excellence en Santé et Services Sociaux, INES, where the focus was on the evaluation of new technologies in real-world context. In August of 2020, Lori started a new chapter in her career as lead of the real-world evidence division, at CADTH. Alex Chambers, who is now manager of the National Oncology Policy at Novartis Oncology, has more than 15 years of experience in health technology assessment for both pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Prior to joining Novartis, Ms. Chambers was the director of CADTH's Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, which conducts health technology assessments for oncology drugs. For nearly 10 years, she was the clinical epidemiologist for Health Quality Ontario and the Ontario Health Technology Advisory Committee, OTAC, whose mandate is to review medical devices and interventions. Chambers holds a master's degree from McMaster University and a Bachelor of Science honors degree from University of Waterloo. Well, thank you for being here to all of our panel. It's wonderful to have you. And we really look forward to your comments today. So to kick off the questions, what do you think about what Barry Lydon presented and the landscape findings? Do you agree? Do you disagree with the findings? What are your thoughts? Let's start with Jacqueline.
Thanks, Barry, and thanks for that lovely introduction and for the invitation to participate today in the panel. I think that the findings broadly reflect kind of my experiences within NICE. With the only exception that I think I was a bit surprised at the frequency that people mentioned that PPI was being used. And I suspect, also based on some of the quotes, that probably some of that might have been more qualitative patient testimony rather than only more quantitative data. So based on my experience and what I've seen within NICE is that there is a general interest in patient preference studies, the recognition that there are certain quite specific situations in which there might be substantial value to having this information available, and that committees would be interested and have considered this type of information valuable. But also that there are also questions about how often we would see this type of information, and whether this is and the fact that it is seen as a kind of complementary or supplementary evidence, and that the clinical and economic evidence will remain the key evidence and the highest priority evidence that will be considered and will influence recommendations. So those are my initial reflections.
We will do a round table of everybody, but just one quick question for you. I like to think of it as the good, the bad, and the ugly. Barry Leiden presented on the neutral reaction, the negative reaction, and the positive reaction to inclusion of patient preferences. So in your role at NICE, where do you think you land? Do you land on the positive, the negative, or the neutral in terms of including patient preferences in decisions?
That's a really good question. I mean, I was one of the people involved in the project that we ran with Myeloma UK a couple of years ago. So I would probably put myself in the positive category. But I do think that I understand some of the hesitations that colleagues might have about this type of information as well. And I also do believe that there is absolutely value in high quality, well conducted patient preference studies, but I also think that they don't take the need away from having high quality evidence on the clinical and economic aspects of a technology. And I can't see that really replacing patient preference studies, replacing some of that key evidence.
Thanks so much. So Nicole, Mitten, Dr. Mitten, what do you think about these findings? Well, I'm going to ask you the second question after, so now you all have a chance to think about the good, the bad, and the ugly. But what do you think about the findings of this survey? Were they accurate? And from your experience, do you agree with them, disagree with them? What do you think?
Well, thanks very much, Barry, and thanks very much for the invitation today. I might answer your question first, and I would say I would put myself in the neutral camp at this time, and only because, you know, our job at our health technology agency is to do appraisal and to go into the work with an unbiased lens, and that's the intention. And so the idea around understanding the methods, which you know, Barry highlighted, you know, the trustworthiness, the quality of the kind of work is really important for us to understand. And also when we're using that type of information to deliberate, you know, ensuring that, you know, there's a knowledge mobilization or education component that was highlighted, and ensuring, you know, how do we use this information? You know, what are the best methods out there, and how do we add it into perhaps our economic analysis? And when I often think about health technology assessment, I think about a number of puzzle pieces to help understand the value of a technology. And this is another puzzle piece, a complementary, and supplementary sounds like it might not be on the same level footing, but complementary, right? To add to the quantitative data, the qualitative data, you know, as we take patient input, you know, we have lots of opportunities to understand patient input, but this is seems like an opportunity to think a little bit differently around how to actually understand what that looks like in different domains or different areas, for example, in the patient lens. And, you know, so we've embarked on, through our scientific advice program and in combination or collaboration with NICE, on understanding patient preferences for specific technologies. And should a manufacturer submit with their drug product, some of the patient preference data, would certainly be able to look at it. But I think it really is about you know, understanding the quality and ensuring that people who are then looking at it understand the value of the data as well.
That's very interesting, and I like your approach from it being complementary and talking about the quality of the input. I'm just wondering, do you think that if the quality of the input was higher, it would be seen as more than complementary and perhaps have greater weight in the decision making?
Yeah, I know. I heard that term weight before, and we struggle not to use how do you weight patient input or patient preference data or clinical data or economic data along the way. It's all used to actually help inform the discussion around the deliberation table. So, we won't give someone a score, for example, or some sort of technique or tool a score, but it adds another layer of confidence, right? And I think that's part of the job of the deliberation table, is to understand how certain or uncertain some of the information is that they're looking at. And anything that could increase the certainty or another way decrease the uncertainty by having common themes or common information, or ensuring that the methods perhaps are of quality that people understand, adds to that improvement in certainty as people are talking about new technologies.
So you scooped one of my future questions, but I'll come back to that on terms of methodologies, and of course we'll discuss the deliberative process. But before going there, we'd love to hear from Dr. Lambert on your position. What do you think of the landscape findings? Do you agree, disagree? And also, of course, and even though you're both from Cardiff, you don't necessarily have to land in the same neutral camp. You can land in one of the other camps for the purposes of
under pressure, Barry. The way I think that I can add to this conversation is more from my experiences of looking at cardiovascular devices, because I can say that, this was something that was a big focus, really, and we probably weren't prepared. I'm talking about from 2004, that I started all this. But it's so, as usual, it's when you, in the real world setting of trying to make these decisions, this is really, really complex. So I have, before coming to CADA, spent a lot of time talking to interventional cardiologists and cardiac surgeons, right? So when we talked about patient preferences, so TAVI was a very good example, which is a less invasive procedure, for aortic stenosis. There was even the idea of patient preferences, but of the clinicians just saying the information, how it was presented to patients, of even making a choice, for example, had a big influence, their understanding of the data and so on. So I just think for me, it's so complex to understand a patient preference. There's so many factors that influence that preference. And that's really important to clinicians. And you and I had discussed previously this idea of we tried to always, right? HTA is about getting the totality of evidence. So input from clinicians of what they felt, was the preference of their patients and what they preferred and why, depending, the same evidence is there, right? But different stakeholders are seeing the same evidence in a different way. So that would be my thing is, yes, patient preference is important. In each situation, whatever the decision problem is, it's more, or you could argue less, not necessarily important, but of how much weight would it have. Sometimes it has a lot of weight, right? If there's two options where the clinical evidence that it's very unclear, which is there a benefit? Well, then patient preference, you could argue, would become more important. And these are the decisions being made every day in the real world setting. So I just think, again, in theory, talking about weights and whatever, but in the reality of being out there in the post-market setting when choices are being made by hospitals, clinicians, patients, patient preferences is there, and we try and bring that to the HTA process to try and inform decision making.
So you touched on so many things that I'd love to get into, including whether or not physicians can truly reflect what patient preference are, or does that have to come from the patient groups themselves? And sometimes, as you know, we work together. Patient and patient groups work together with physicians and have a common understanding of the situation. But in other cases, physicians don't accurately reflect the views of patients. And you know, it was a really interesting example that you gave with a cardiac medical device where, as I understand it, at least in the province of Ontario, a decision to reimburse for a medical device was based really on the patient preferences, who were prepared to travel and to spend money, so to speak, in order to have the device, where the evidence might have made a contrary decision. So it's interesting to see that those patient preferences can, on some occasions, actually be more than complementary and actually, you know, be more persuasive. So,
I can
you know,
tell
I'm
you
not
in
going to.
that instance, if you had talked to the surgeons, they really wanted to know, how did those results come about and how did they arrive at those results, right? Because they felt like if they had been more involved, the results could have been different. So that's
Exactly.
right.
Sometimes there can be differences between the two perceptions. And you know, I'm not going to let you go without landing on the findings of the landscape survey. Do you find yourself in the neutral camp, in the more positive camp in terms of including patient preferences, or in the negative camp? I have a feeling I know what the answer is, but go ahead.
Well, I think, again, over my career, right, of thinking even about the patient perspective has grown, and we start to understand more and more of how important it is. But I don't think you can answer. I think every decision problem that we have, it's going to be different, of the good, the bad, or the ugly. I think it would change in every single instance of what is the decision problem, what's the setting. You know, that's
So no
what
one rule. No one rule. Everyone is individually decided.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's get a little bit of a different perspective and speak to Alex Chambers, who's had you know, both experiences working inside health technology assessment bodies, as well as from the industry perspective. So we'll turn to you, Alex. What do you think about the landscape findings? Do you agree with them, disagree with them? And then I may as well ask you up front, which camp are you going to land in, neutral, positive, or negative in terms of inclusion of patient preferences?
Great, thanks, Barry, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this panel today. It's really fascinating to listen to everyone's perspective. In terms of the survey, I think I'm quite aligned with where Jacqueline had landed in sort of her initial comments. I don't know that it's entirely surprising. I do get the sense that there was, you know, the description of PPI may have been slightly interpreted differently depending on the respondent to the survey. So you do wonder how much of that was it, you know, true sort of PPI sort of studies, or was it more of a patient input summary? But regardless, I found the results to be quite interesting in that they were validating in a lot of ways. I think a lot of things that we would have expected, you know, in terms of, you know, thinking about time constraints and, you know, why is it not as considered as much in the HTA process, talking about it being supplementary or complementary. I think that really aligns with sort of common thinking about that sort of thing. I guess the one piece that came up to me, and maybe it, you know, thinking that this might be, the questions might have been, people were leaning more towards the qualitative input. I'd be curious to understand from a patient group perspective, you know, do they feel that they're having as much influence as the HTA bodies are thinking that they have, and really trying to understand what the balance might be there. But maybe I'll just take a minute and sort of talk about the industry perspective on this, because I think the industry absolutely has a role to play here. And I know Novartis has done some of, or sort of has stepped into this space a little bit, and a few years ago did a study in Canada, a patient preference study in melanoma. And, you know, and it's too bad Deborah Marshall isn't here, because she was the one who said that you've got to start these trials early. And the challenge that we encountered was that we started that study so late that it actually didn't it wasn't finished before the HTA process started. So there's a timing issue there, but I think like there's lessons to be learned from the industry side and really trying to figure out when do you do these trials. But I think just in having the experience of doing that trial for melanoma, we've expanded. We're doing it in a few other areas now. We're moving them up, doing them a little bit earlier so that they actually can inform the HTA process. But what we also realized is that it's not just the HTA process that these patient preference studies can influence. They can actually have a much greater impact. And as you talk about the life cycle, I think there's a lot more to be gained rather than just sort of that snapshot of the HTA. There's a lot more value that these studies can actually offer. And in terms of your, and I liked everybody's response on the, negative, neutral, or positive. I think I'm probably more neutral positive, but I agree with Lori in that, you probably don't need to do one of these studies in every case, but it's just, being very thoughtful about where you would invest and where it's really going to have a meaningful impact.
So that's a great segue to my next question. But before I ask you the next question, I'm compelled because you brought it up to say that we at Colorectal Cancer Canada have developed a stakeholder charter for engagement of trial sponsors and patient groups in clinical trials. And in order to get that perspective from patients and patient groups, it's essential that patient groups be included in the clinical trial process from ideation of the trial all the way through the continuum. And that way we can really truly understand the patient perspective as opposed to just-in-time evidence when it's submitted for HTA. But, to your last point, when is patient preferences not useful? And I'd ask you, Alex, to kick it off, and then anybody could jump in with their comments on it. When is it not useful to have patient preferences included?
That's a good question, Barry. I'm gonna need to think about that because maybe there is an opportunity in a lot of cases to have it. I guess. Yeah, I'm gonna need to reflect on that. Maybe I'll let someone else comment and I'll think about it.
Well, I mean, the reverse of that, the good news is that if you can't think of an answer, then it means it should always be included. So,
well,
go ahead, Nicole.
Can I try? I mean, I don't
Sure.
have an answer either, Alex. So that's good. I think, I just want to make sure that we're all sort of on the same page of the definition, right? So when I say neutral, it's about how do we incorporate a new method or a method into sort of an established process, right? And so that means methodological rigor, quality, but that doesn't mean that I'm neutral about patient input and patient information that helps inform the health technology assessment. In fact, that's required, right? And we have that as not only our submission, but it's how does that information then help inform and take a piece of the lens that we might not see with the clinical trial data, and we certainly don't see with the economic data. And it could be around, when would it be useful rather than not useful? I mean, things like where there are real implementation issues, right? When there are challenges with scheduling, where there are location issues, or when there are dosing issues, right? So when there are safety issues. And I think that those are the kinds of reasons you would want to have that information at the deliberation table. The trade-offs between, or, Lori explained the TAVI example. Patients would rather have one live through a side effect, but have it administered a different way. Things like that. And I think that that's where there's confusion about, linking the clinical trial data or that uncertainty that I spoke about earlier with how do we actually then see what's the most important thing to patients. And I guess maybe the other thing is, I think previously you asked about what else could it be used for, right? I mean, I think even planning, like if you understand how patients are prefer a dose or an administration or a safety or an efficacy or how they've weighted things along the way, that can inform the way you do research, protocols, study designs, and then it can help you actually improve the way, not just having a patient sit on a clinical trial panel, but actually inform the kinds of either primary or secondary outcomes that you need to collect, right? And I think those are often maybe pragmatic clinical trials too, right? That can help inform that kind of work, and along with informing how the HTA is conducted or is, the value of the technology is discussed.
Jacqueline or Laurie?
Yeah, I think I would say that there are situations in which I wouldn't say necessarily that a patient preference information would be unhelpful or a quantitative study would have no value. But in terms of, I can think of two situations in which it might be, I would think it would be unlikely that it would have a big influence on the decision being made. And that would be a situation where you're comparing almost identical technologies. So if there are no real trade-offs between the different alternative treatment options that are being made, they have very similar effectiveness, they have very similar safety, and there's not a big difference in the experience of using that technology for patients, then I would wonder what the value would be in providing insight into what probably would be very subtle differences. And I think on the other hand, I can also think of a situation where you have two treatment options where one is clearly superior in terms of having a much better safety profile or having substantial health improvements over the standard of care. So if there's a clearly superior alternative, you might still want a supportive study that actually shows that is in line with if that superiority is actually there. But thinking about patient preference studies as something that is still cost time and money, there still is an opportunity cost to consider, right? So that in those types of situations, you could question whether you would need a study to support these types of decisions.
Right, and I guess there's all types of ways to include it. There could be a full-blown study, and there could be, the anecdotal story as an example. And, I just coming back to what Nicole was talking about in terms of, different times to include, I was really pleased to see that CAT asked for patient group input on a treatment algorithm in colorectal cancer as it happens. And I'm looking forward to seeing how that input, both from patient groups, patients, and physicians, will be included. And I think that'll be a really, new approach, at least for us. But to come back to your point, Jacqueline, it was really, you made me think of something when we provided input on two different drugs, which were very similar, NTRK fusion drugs. And what we were looking for was from the patient population, what were the differences in it? Even though they were similar mechanisms, really, to your point, we were wondering, how patients felt about the side effects, were there any difference, or the effectiveness of the drug over longer periods of time. So sometimes, even though it may look like, they're identical and there may not be value, we can sometimes pick up some differences, from the patient perspective and their quality of life. So not ignoring you, Laurie, go ahead, your comments on that.
Well, I just wanted, it sort of refers back to Jacqueline and again shows how complex it is, because back to bypass surgery versus TAVI, that was where it was very disruptive because the clinical evidence showed that in certain age groups and right a certain, like the severity of the disease, that bypass surgery had better outcomes, better longer term outcomes. It was much more cost effective. So if that's what you looked at, it was clear, and that was even the clinical guidelines were, no, you should do bypass surgery in that setting. But the patients, again, and this is what the interventionists were saying, our patients want a TAVI, even if it isn't better, even if it isn't, right, more cost effective. That's what they want. And that was the dilemma. So just to point out that again, so there, how that, then it was a real question. Well, how much weight are we going to give that that's what patients want if it's going to cost more to the system and the clinical evidence shows no, you should actually have a bypass surgery. Mm-hmm. So just right, that's why it was okay. What do we do now? So for me, it's just a really good example of it really put it out there of how much weight are we willing to give for patient preferences.
Right, and for those who are interested, we actually did a full study of that, a case study of that in one of the previous webinars, which you can access from, that I mentioned before, from 2020, where Health Quality Ontario, Nancy Sickish, I think, presented on that. Nicole, you touched on something that was really interesting. You talked about the deliberative process, and I was wondering if you're, Jacqueline, if you're also using a deliberative process, and what other elucidation methods that you're using? Are you using discrete choice experiment, ranking methodology in different methods, or rating methods, or something else? I wonder if you all could respond to that. How are you evaluating patient preferences?
So at NICE, we also use a deliberative process, and the way that we currently include patient preferences is by having patient representatives who attend and participate in appraisal committees. So that is much more a patient testimony qualitative way. NICE doesn't perform patient preference studies, or we don't perform them ourselves, but companies can submit these types of studies. We don't have a preference for a method, but in the research project that we did, and I referred to earlier, we do find that discrete choice experiments and best worst scaling were the most, not necessarily always the best method, but are the kind of the most well-established methods. And also, especially discrete choice experiments, the method that I'm personally most familiar with. So those would be the two methods that we identified as being most commonly used. But they do have some drawbacks, and I think one of the perhaps not concerns, but some of the hesitancy is that you cannot do a discrete choice experiment for every decision problem, or it's not an appropriate tool to use in for every patient population, or for every intervention under consideration. They can be resource intensive, they can be cognitively challenging. So it is not necessarily an instrument that will work for every decision problem, every population.
So from an industry perspective, and you're doing a patient preference studies, is there a preferred methodology that Novartis or other companies that you've seen have utilized?
So I think, again, aligned with what Jacqueline had said, I think most experience that we have is with the discrete choice experiments. However, again, I think the field is evolving, and also, as Jacqueline noted, it doesn't always fit in every situation, but I think that's probably where we have most experience. Maybe just one other thing, Barry, because you touched on it earlier. So I know Colorectal Cancer Canada has their patient charter. Novartis also has their commitment to patients as well. And the intent of that really is to find a way to engage patients as early on in the process, so that they are actually informing the clinical trial design and right through the process, because again, having that voice really really engaged and really involved is I think critical. And so while it's important in these patient preference studies, it's also equally as important in the actual clinical trial design that, as we've all mentioned, really carries the bulk of the weight in a lot of these HTA decisions.
Thanks, Alice. I'm very conscious of the time going by so fast, and I could speak the whole day on this, and most of you know that. I wouldn't even require answers from yourselves. But I do have two quick questions. One, how do you find patients? We have to look all over the world in many cases, and as a patient group, that poses a very significant challenges. But whether you're at CADIT or at NICE or in industry, what is the best methodology for finding patients? I'm going to start with Jacqueline because I think you have a special answer to that.
Thanks. Yeah. So we have a patient and public involvement team, and they are incredible. So I work in scientific advice, and we strive to involve patient experts in all of the projects that we do as well. So we have a dedicated team who work with patient charities and find patient experts and representatives to get involved. And sometimes it can be really challenging, but they do an amazing job. So we've got a dedicated resource, and it is a variety of ways in which they identify patients, but they have a well-established network, I think, at this point. And patient charities and patient organizations are I think, a way in which we identify patients.
And do you help the patient organizations to find patients?
Do we help patient organizations to find patients?
Yes. Through the clinical studies, perhaps, or PIs?
I'm not sure, actually. You would have to ask one of my colleagues.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll turn that over to the same question to Laurie and Nicole. You explain.
Well, I was going to say, Barry, that just to be honest, like I was involved. It was an HTAi impact story, but we tried to work with patients from the beginning to the end of an HTA process for cardiac defibrillators. And so we tried to find representative patients, and Ines, has a patient engagement group as well, and it was really, really hard, and it took us a long time. We talked to the clinicians. There were 6 clinics where they were implanting defibrillators. We went to the clinicians. We tried to talk to the nurses, but they were hesitant, to talk, even again, time and whatever, to talk to patients. Would they be willing? So just to say, there's going to have to be some work on how to do that and the whole trust process and so on. And it just reminded me when you asked that question that the nurses, I've again, over 20 years, right? Lots of experiences, but nurses feel like nurses have a lot more communication with patients, you could argue, than clinicians do. Mm-hmm. And I know nurses feel like they're often forgotten in this whole process of appraisal and evaluation and input, because they feel they are the ones talking to the patients and the nurses, patients and their families much more, and that they actually have a lot of insight. And I know, the feedback I got, that we don't think of them often enough and value their input.
That's an excellent point. And for those, who know the Quebec system, the infirmière pivot, the nurse navigators and so forth, nurse practitioners can play a very useful role, and something that I actually hadn't thought of. So that's a great suggestion. Nicole, did you want to do that before we go to our wrap-up question?
Yeah, as usual, I like to listen to Laurie a lot. And so, just on the nurse end, certainly the clinician is perhaps the decision maker about which treatment pathway to choose, but the actual management, right, is often done with a non-physician clinician, right? Yeah. So how do we manage that? So they often are closer to the way that patients are experiencing the technology, for example. I think I have something very similar to say as Jacqueline. We have a patient engagement team at CADIT who have an established network, but always, improving or trying to enhance that established network with patient organizations or patient donor groups or patient charities, and we have an established process to have patient input come into our health technology assessments, and whether we reach out to the groups actively or we use our process to achieve or receive patient input information, and there are mechanisms by which our either our pharmaceutical reviews or our patient engagement team reaches out. So it could be a public call for input that's required. So there are lots of different ways that we try, and always willing to learn different ways to approach it. We are working with the James Lind Alliance, and so priority setting around patients and their needs, and usually for research and endeavors, but that's another way of linking into groups that are then really keen to participate in work to ensure that the patient voice is being heard. So lots of different ways to approach it.
And Barry, we're really hoping to start to create an inventory of patient organizations, like to get better at least finding the organizations and finding patients. So if you have ideas, we're happy to listen.
Yeah, I have lots of ideas, and we're going to go global. So rapid fire conclusion before Barry Lydon does a wrap up. My question to you is, how do you envision the future of patient and patient group engagement to elicit patient preferences in health technology assessment? What do you think the future is going to bring? We'll start with Alex this time.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think I alluded to it a little bit earlier from an industry perspective. I think you are going to see more of these patient preference studies coming from industry and being supported by industry, which I think with the development of having more of these studies go into HTA, there will be more of a process. There's a parallel with all the real world evidence as well, and as HTA see more real world evidence coming in, they develop more methodology on how to incorporate that into the deliberative process, and I see this being a very similar process because it is important. I think we continually see patients being engaged more and more and more, and not just checking the box, but really being actively engaged. And I think as that continues, I think that's how it's going to build momentum, and then it will really carry a lot more weight. Again, I'm not to use that word, but might have more influence.
I don't mind that word, so that we're okay with that. Jacqueline?
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's really great and encouraging that patient organizations are interested in doing these types of studies as well. I think there's an obvious and natural interest from industry and how these types of studies can support their product. But I think it's an important way for patient organization as another key stakeholder in the process to also make sure that they're representing and bringing in the voice of the population that they're representing in that process, and providing high quality evidence through these types of studies, I think is really a way in which they can contribute to that process more than they're already, of course, doing. So I'm hoping to see more of these studies, patient-led ones.
Thank you. Lori?
I think what I'm going to say is that what I see in the future is that we need it's going to evolve, and we're going to have more patient preferences, but I really think that where we have to get to is having that multi-stakeholder group around the table, but with everyone having a common vision. So in another panel that I was in, we said how important to have clinical experts who understand the health system and all the issues that we have to consider of cost effectiveness. Like, it's complex to make decisions, and it's really hard, right? And so we need patient organizations who also are educated, right? They're going to gradually learn the process to not, for everyone wants something, if you see what I mean, and has different needs, but also wishes. And all those things have to be weighed up. So we have to be able to listen to each other and understand, or if not understand, but at least listen to the other point of view. Like, that's how we have to move forward. And this is, as Nicole said, this is just one more piece of the puzzle that should be added, like real world evidence. But it's putting it all together takes people collaborating.
I think if there's one thing that COVID showed us is that if we can make quick decisions, we can make quick approvals when we all collaborate and all together under one tent, so to speak. We can make it happen. So let's hope that inertia continues even post-COVID. Nicole, last word.
Wow, lots of pressure. And maybe I could say under the umbrella of real world evidence, I would think that patient outcomes, patient preferences might actually fall under that umbrella as well, that they're not two distinct entities, and that it's, I sort of always define and, in my head that anything outside of a clinical trial paradigm is really a real world evidence, real world data, and which could include patient reported outcomes or patient outcomes or discrete choice experiment information as well. I think that what I would really, I think that the importance of this work will continue to grow. I think, including it into submissions for health technology assessments so that, we can get reviewers familiar, methodologists aware and comfortable with that kind of methodology will be really important over the next little while. And I think that because we're having this talk for HTAi, right, this is a learning opportunity for all health technology assessment agencies to work together, right, on how we can do this work with the best, how we can review technologies with the best type of evidence. And I know, methodologically, the HTA agencies are always in communication with respect to, either new products or potentially new designs, and we might have to, be better at communicating our learnings as well, or how we integrate. So I think that that's sort of where I would say that this would, the patient preference work could fall under that umbrella.
Well, that's a perfect conclusion, and thank you all for a wonderful panel. And we don't do this often enough, so let's look forward to the next time when we can do this, and maybe make it a regular annual meeting where we can do this. But now I'm going to turn it back over to Barry Lydon, the co-chair of the Patient and Preference Working Group, and take it away, Barry, and let's wrap things up.
Great. Thanks so much, Barry Stein, and appreciate everyone's involvement in this and interest in trying to improve the patient opportunities to be heard in the decision-making process through quantitative or qualitative data. As Barry intimated at the beginning of this discussion, this webinar is actually almost a kickoff of the next phase of what we're trying to do at HTAi. And we've identified the need to really ensure that we're collaborating with a multiple number of different groups out there who are involved in this. And I think what we heard today really reinforces some of what we had thought we should do here. And that is, one, to, co-develop educational materials with organizations so that we can all ensure that we're all speaking the same language, as Jacqueline mentioned at the beginning, and I think Alex also mentioned, I think that maybe some of the responses, the high incidence of, or the 90% response rate that they are using, HTAs are using PPI, might be a definitional issue, and that's okay, but I think that helping educate decision makers about what really is a PPI and how it can really be used is an important step. Also, as Barry mentioned, part of our work plan here is to really co-create, partner with HTAs in an effort to move forward and chart out and keep track of what do we learn as we go through this process. There have been other case studies that have been done, so we anticipate that this will supplement or complement the case study review, but it kind of answers the big question that we're hearing from the survey and from some of the qualitative evidence that we've gathered, which is that HTAs want more examples of how this can be done. So this is our contribution at HTAi to do that, and Barry Stein and Deborah Marshall and others on our working group are working to help develop that study. So if anyone at HTAi is interested in participating or joining us on that effort, please contact us. The next area is developing best practices or grades, ways to evaluate the quality or the rigor of the patient preference information, and then producing a playbook on exactly how would you apply patient preference information to an HTA. As you note, there are a number of logos at the bottom of this slide here to connote that there are a number of different players. In fact, there are probably several others that are not included, but we have already started to work with the Patient Focused Medicines Development Group, Medical Device Innovation Consortium, ISPOR, and I might prefer to take some of the work that each of those organizations have done to hopefully the next level and to collaborate, recognizing that each organization has its strengths and we can work together to try to find a solution. So with that, I think really appreciate everybody's attention to this matter and everybody's involvement in this webinar. And as Barry said, we look forward to the next step in the discussion as we try to incorporate patient perspectives in the healthcare decision making. Thanks.